How soon is too soon to draft Patrick Mahomes? And what round is that sweet spot to draft your first tight end? We'll answer those questions and more on this special three-part series of the Football Guys Power Grid. I'm Austin Lee. I'm joined by David Dodds, Dan Hindrey, and James Brimacombe. And over the next three shows, we're going to cover best ball tournaments at draft.com. So this is the first show, and on show number one, we're going to offer sort of general strategies and roster construction and ideas for how to best win at draft. And we're going to go position by position and identify a few key players and rounds that you want to draft those guys. But before we dive into sort of the juicy picks here, David, I'm going to pitch it to you to just give us a quick overview of what it's like to play at draft for people who have no idea what it's like.
Yeah, tremendous. A lot of fun. You can draft from your phone. You can draft, literally from your computer. The good thing is they've gotten rid of kickers. They've gotten rid of defenses. So, it's extremely easy. So what we're going to talk about here is essentially an 18-round draft where you're drafting nothing but quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. It's a best ball format. And for those that haven't played that, you'll just get the top quarterback, the top two running backs, the top three receivers, the top tight end, and then your top flex each week that they do. So you want a deep team, and you'll capitalize when your players actually have their big weeks. It'll run through weeks 1 through 16. Biggest score wins, and they pay out accordingly. So.
Yeah, to me, it's sort of like this nice hybrid between sort of like daily fantasy sports and a standard fantasy league. It's sort of like you've got the prize pools and things that sort of mimic some of the things you see in daily fantasy sports, but it's over the entire season, weeks 1 through 16, like you would see in a season-long league. So it's like kind of like the best of both worlds. And you don't have to worry about any sort of in-season management. There's no trades, no waiver stuff. It automatically gives you your best team, so you don't have to worry about start-sit decisions. So it's kind of cool. It's like the draft, and then you sort of like watch what happens.
And another big piece of this that I forgot is it's 30 seconds per pick. So these things happen, and it happens fast. So literally you can spend 10, 15 minutes, and you're usually completed with a draft. So.
Yeah, and we're going to tell you guys how to be prepared for that, because those 30 seconds can feel quick if you're not ready sort of with a list of guys you want to draft. Dan, I'll pitch it to you on this. There's different contest sizes. Can you just talk briefly about that?
Yeah, so most of the contests, the bigger money prize contests are 12-team, which I'd say is maybe the standard format. But they have all sizes. You can do head-to-head. You can do 3-team, 6-team, 10-team. 10 teams are pretty popular. 3 teams are fun because you can do the draft in 10, 15 minutes. You're just playing against 2 opponents. Goes real quick. So kind of whatever you're into. Like I said, 10 and 12 are probably the most popular.
Yeah, those sound fun, and those sound more like what you would do sort of like with your buddies in your friends and family league. James, tell me a little bit about what interests you most about playing a draft.
Yeah, sure. Everybody loves fantasy football. It always comes down to the draft. Everyone loves the draft, and basically it's right in the name, draft.com. So they're fast. You can, like David said, you can do 30-second leagues you can do fast drafts, or they also offer slow drafts, which about 8-hour timer. I've been known to do like 100 of those at a time, and yeah, so it's a very fun game. It's kind of why we all love fantasy football. And you can start as early as February, right after the Super Bowl. So yeah, it's a lot of fun.
And that's what these guys have been doing. I mean, you hear James mention 100 drafts at once. I mean, we've got our experienced and most passionate best ball guys here on the show to give you some wisdom here. And these guys definitely started back in February. David, let's shift over to some strategy advice here. We're going to talk about things like setting up your personal rankings, or maybe using the ADP tool. Why don't you talk about one of those things?
Yeah, because there's so many drafts that are happening, the ADP actually on draft is pretty good. It's a pretty good indicator of when players actually will get drafted. But just like anything, if you draft completely by ADP, you're going to end up with an average team and probably not going to win. So it's real key, I think, to identify guys that are exceptional value around their ADP so that you can kind of target, build your team around then. And then I generally then try to craft backwards from there. So I know a few guys I'm going to get. Since I'm going to have those positions, how do I build the rest of the roster in to kind of make that work? I think roster construction is a big deal, but I'll probably shoot that over to somebody else to go over, because I think a lot of lesser players or haven't played a lot of these drafts potentially are making big pitfalls with just their roster construction.
Yeah, Dan, why don't I pitch it over to you to talk about roster construction a little bit and tell us like which format you're thinking about for this roster construction. Is it a 12-team format?
Well, it probably works for any of the formats because you have 18 players no matter what.
Yeah.
So I think it's pretty similar no matter what format you're playing. But in general, I think you want to have 2 quarterbacks just because you're going to have a bye week. So obviously 2 is a minimum. You can go to 3 if you want. 5 running backs, 7 wide receivers, 2 tight ends is kind of your minimums. And that adds up to 16. And then that leaves you with a couple of what I call like free agent picks. So when you get to the end, it could just be based on what value's there. Like, if there's a guy you like, just take him. But then it also gives you some leeway to adjust as the draft's going. Like if you've taken a couple tight ends early, you probably don't need a 3rd tight end. If you have a really strong quarterback too, you probably don't need, a 3rd quarterback. But if for example, you waited at quarterback, then you might need that 3rd guy for some upside, or, you're not as confident in your top 2 guys to have big weeks. So, those kind of get you through the bye weeks, especially, like wide receiver and running back. You want to have at least 5 or 6 running backs because injuries happen, bye weeks. It's the position where there's going to be the most turnover. So a minimum of 5, you can go to 6, even 7 if you've loaded up early on the other positions. Wide receiver, since you need 3 in your lineup, I think 7 is a good minimum because the way the bye weeks work, you're almost always going to have some weeks where you have at least 2 wide receivers on bye. So if you have even a single injury, then you're counting on every single guy. You want to have some fallback because you're going to have guys who get hurt. You're going to have guys who have a bad week. So with needing at least 3 of those guys in there and being able to use a 4th as a flex, I think you want at least 7 wide receivers.
Yeah, that seems like a good breakdown. And I like what you're saying about sort of like going with sort of a rough game plan and a couple of spots of flexibility depending on how the draft unfolds. James, do you have any differences that you have sort of with your roster construction than the way Dan described it?
I think Dan nailed a lot of the good points that I kind of how I build my teams as well. I do a lot of the 3-mans, a lot of the 10-mans, a lot of the 12-mans, but they really are pretty much similar builds. But I like his, 2 quarterbacks and then 6 running backs, 6 wide receivers, and 2 tight ends. And then that gives you the flexibility at the end. Because, I like to go kind of heavy with running back and wide receiver to start. So almost at my first 8 rounds, I'm kind of just only looking at those positions and then kind of going from there. But yeah, what else there's one thing with those fast drafts I wanted to go back to real quick.
Oh yeah, please do.
Is rankings are the ADP is so sharp on there right now, draft, but rankings, you can do your own rankings, but they also have a sidebar next to the rankings where it is do your roster it limits. So you can actually, sometimes you're seeing on Twitter, people posting bogus lineups with 6 quarterbacks or whatnot, but there's actually just a thing as simple as going into that draft app and your max limits, and you can actually put 3 quarterbacks, 6 running backs, 7 wide receivers, and 2 tight ends. And that's the total of 18. And you'll never go over that. Say if you're off to lunch or a meeting and you can't get back to your draft. So I think that's like a trick that nobody really understands or knows. So
yeah, if you lose your internet connection, you don't want to suddenly come back to it and be like, why do I have 6 quarterbacks? This is awful.
Yeah, exactly.
David, do you have any other thoughts on roster construction? It's such an important topic here. I want to kind of get everybody's take on it.
Yeah, I think Dan's got it exactly right, although I will say I almost always have 3 quarterbacks. And I say that because it's the highest scoring position. If you lose any one of your 2 quarterbacks, if you decide to only go with 2, you probably aren't going to win a best ball league. You're going to lose that on that week that he's on bye. And then let's just say they face a stellar defense like Chicago or something, and that quarterback has a bad game. And a couple horrible quarterback games in a shortened season, that's enough to lose your best ball game. So I almost always make sure I'm one of the guys that have 3 quarterbacks. But that said, I won't draft some of the stars early. I wait a while. I just make sure I'm one of the few teams that has 3 starting quarterbacks.
Yeah, and I think the longer you wait on quarterback, the more likely it is for you to
Right.
want 3 instead of 2.
Right.
I think that's a good. Oh, sorry, Dan. Go ahead.
I was going to say part of the different strategies, I think, I really like having 2 shots at a really high upside quarterback. So I like to get my second quarterback fairly early in that 12th or 13th round. And part of doing that, when I went through last season and kind of looked at how many decent weeks do the top quarterbacks have. When I looked at it, there were 13 quarterbacks who had at least 10 weeks where they were at least hitting 16 points. So if you get one of those top guys, your floor is pretty high from a week-to-week basis. So, and if you have 2 of those guys who are kind of hitting 10, 12 good weeks, you have most of those weeks covered. I kind of understand it, especially if you really want to wait at quarterback, it totally makes sense to get 3, which is why I kind of leave it open. But for me personally, I'm usually getting that second quarterback a little bit earlier probably than David is, which is why, I tend to have 2 a little bit more often, but then I leave the door open for 3. And especially I think there's some really good options even in the 17th or 18th round right now. Ryan Fitzpatrick, Marcus Mariota, some of those guys where, if you look at the board and there's nothing left at wide receiver, then yeah, maybe it does make sense to get that third quarterback. And he might not be in your lineup too often, but if he has one 35-point week, he kind of pays himself off in that 18th round just on that week.
Fitzpatrick has had some of those weeks in the past, it's for sure. Well, that's kind of a nice segue into moving on to talking about sort of the sweet spots for each position. We've started talking about it a little bit. Before we dive into that, though, I just want to let people know we've got this amazing Draft Dominator mobile app. It's a great way to do mock drafts. It's a great way to, sort of have a draft list adapt as you do your draft live with your friends or with a league online. Make sure you check that out by going to the iTunes store or to the Google Play Store and searching for Footballguys Draft Dominator. You will enjoy it. It's free. And then there's a premium upgrade you can get to unlock the full features, but it completely works for free. Go try it out. Let's talk about quarterbacks. We're going to go position by position and talk about sweet spots. We talked about quarterbacks a little bit. James, I want to hear a little bit more from you about what round you're kind of looking for, say, your starting quarterback, and who are some of those guys you usually get around that round?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So I just did a kind of a spreadsheet where I looked at all my exposure in 12-man drafts. So I've done about 650 or so of them so far. But it was kind of interesting to see. I picked the top 3 at each round, who was my highest owned that round. So the first one that comes up was round 9 was Carson Wentz at 17%. The next one, round 10, Jared Goff. He was 10%. Round 11, Lamar Jackson, 16%. And then round 12, Kirk Cousins, 24%. Kirk Cousins is my highest owned player on all my drafts right now. Just getting a starting quarterback in round 12, where I can load up all the other positions. Then round 12, you get Kirk Cousins, who has Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs and Kyle Rudolph and Delvin Cook. And I just think that's one of the best values right now. Just looking at the last 4 years, he's finished as a quarterback 9, quarterback 5, and quarterback 9. And right now his ADP is quarterback 20. So I don't think you can find a better value. And as far as with David and Dan talking about the 3 quarterbacks, I do prefer 3 quarterbacks. Just because of that value. Because I think in those late rounds, like getting even a Nick Foles or Andy Dalton, it's just more valuable almost than trying to just take some rookie that the third string right now might not play. So I like locking in those points. And just I also did a study looking at injuries. So last year I did a bunch of the championships on draft, and I looked at by week 12 how many players I had injured. And at quarterback, it was 40% chance that one of your quarterbacks would get injured, and that was looking at over 200 teams or so. So so there is a chance you might go down to one quarterback, and then you have the bye weeks, and things happen. So I like the idea of 3 quarterbacks and just being safe there rather than taking an 8th wide receiver that may never score for you.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it sounds like David and James are more in the 3 quarterback camp, and then Dan is maybe a little of both, but leans slightly towards the 2 quarterback camp. David, we hear James saying he's getting most of his first quarterbacks like round 9 through 12-ish, it sounds like. I'm guessing you're going later than that. Tell me about that.
I'm similar. I honestly, usually when I compete in 12-mans definitely when I compete in 10-mans, I just turn off the tight end and quarterback position for the first 8 picks. I don't want to be tempted. Oh, Zach Ertz looks like a deal. I'll occasionally peek, but I generally just don't want to take either of those positions before 8 players are taken in. Ideally, I'd like to have 4 running backs, 4 receivers after 8. And then I started looking at quarterbacks. I mean, I do like Carson Wentz in the 9th. I like Cam Newton in the 9th. Russell Wilson a lot of times is in the 10th. Goff sometimes in the 10th. If I haven't gotten anybody by the 11th, I am just picking quarterback. So I'm the same thing. Generally, even the 11th, if they're going a lot faster, I'll usually go 11 and 12, get 2 quarterbacks, and then look towards the later rounds to add my 3rd. At some point, regardless of what they should be going for, if your draft is hammering quarterbacks, you can't really have a good team without some quarterbacks. So at some point you have to flow with that. But generally I won't even look until 9. I'll let everybody take all the stars, and then I just see what's out there. But Wentz and Cam Newton are the 2 that I own the most.
Yeah, that's funny. Like, you don't want to get caught up in a run, but eventually, like, if enough of those guys go, you kind of got to do something.
Participating in the run, hopefully you got your value on all the other guys because you waited. But
yeah, that's another trick too. Like, if you're at the turn in round 10 through 13, you can just grab 2 quarterbacks there, and then the people after you, they're going to be forced to take them. So then you're going to have other players down the line drop to you. So I kind of like doing that too.
It always feels good to be the start of a run, not at the end of a run.
Right.
Dan, I want to ask you about your quarterback strategy in the sweet spot. These other guys are saying, hey, we kind of ignore quarterback the first 8 rounds. How far would Patrick Mahomes have to fall before you're like, you know what, I can't ignore it anymore. I got to take him?
It's actually not too far for me. He's not somebody I go out of my way for, but if he falls, his ADP's kind of right by the 3-4 turn and a 12-teamer. There's a few guys in there where those top running backs, Josh Jacobs and some of those guys, I prefer them over him. And then the last wide receiver who I like is Chris Godwin. I'm kind of leaning towards Godwin over Mahomes. Once those guys are gone, though, and sometimes Mahomes does fall, I'm fine with him in that mid to late 4th round. And it kind of comes down to how repeatable you think last year was. He might not get 50, but if you think he's got a good shot of 40 or 45 touchdowns, then he's totally worth that 3rd or 4th round pick. So I'm fine with him. He's not one of the top guys I'm targeting. A couple other guys have already mentioned Cam Newton. That's my guy this year. I play a little more aggressively in terms of trying to target upside. And part of that, I think, James does more, just 12-team simple top 3 win. I'm mostly a tournament guy. So I like building in a little bit more upside because in those tournaments, you need to have a 1 in 1,000 type of team to really do any damage. So I'm not really drafting defensively like, if this guy gets hurt, just because you're kind of assuming that you need some stuff to go right. And one of the things, if I'm going to assume I need something to go right, I'm kind of okay with assuming that my quarterbacks make it through the year. Kind of along those lines, I really like the athletic quarterbacks because those rushing touchdowns, the points really add up, and that's kind of why I'm on Cam. The one guy who I'm pretty intrigued by this year is Kyler Murray too. So I'm typically waiting until 9th or 10th round, but if the draft falls a certain way and there's nobody I'm really excited about there in the 8th round, I'm taking some shots on Kyler Murray just because that 4.3 speed, I think he's going to have some weeks where he's just like, oh, there goes Kyler Murray for a 50-yard rushing touchdown. And those big point weeks are what you're really looking for at the quarterback. Because, like I said, I think you can get the floor. There's a lot of guys who give you that 16, 18 points every week. But it's fun to have somebody who can have those 30, 40-point weeks. So Kyler Murray is another guy. Behind Cam, those are probably my two main guys this year.
Yeah, you kind of set up a slight tease for show 2 that we're going to be doing, where we're focusing more on the championship format than we are on sort of the standard 12-team format. We'll talk more about that in episode 2, but we'll definitely be wanting to give you some tips on how to get that top $1 million prize in the $3.5 million championship that they're running over there. The format's a little different, and we'll talk more about that in episode 2. Let's talk a little bit about running backs. Mr. Dodds, I'm going to pass it to you to talk about how you approach running backs. Where are the sweet spots here? And not just for sort of your top guys, but how you fill out all your running backs down the line.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like I said, my strategy at both running back and receivers to go early and often. I try to get stars. But guys that I find I get every draft, I get Sony Michel in the 5th and love him there. I think he has ridiculous upside. I know slightly banged up and stuff, but he's back off the PUP list. Lamar Miller's one I like. I like Darius Geis a lot. You can get those guys in the 7th round. I like Freeman in the 8th as somebody that ends up on a lot of my roster. So again, I'll hit running back pretty hard, try to keep a balanced approach. And then super late, you can get McKinnon super late. And then who else is somebody I like quite a bit? It was Mike Davis. You can literally, Mike Davis, a dart throw, but he honestly might win the Chicago, job. So drafting early, you get an advantage of taking a guy that's going really late. He has an ADP of 193, so almost in the last few rounds of the draft, but he could actually start. And then there's a few other guys like that too. I mean, if you want to bet against Melvin Gordon, you've got Austin Eckler, you got Justin Jackson. If you want to bet against Zeke, you got Tony Pollard. So you've got some of these guys that, again, depending on the kind of game style you're playing, if you picked up value everywhere else, you start making dart throws, just hoping for home run plays.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting over the next few weeks to see how some of these depth chart situations completely flip some of the ADP of some of these guys. Right. And it'll be good to be on the front end of picking the right guy as opposed to kind of being late to the party. Dan, tell me about your running back approach.
Yeah, I usually try to get at least one or two early. If you land one of those top 5 picks, I feel like you almost have to go running back there just because those guys score so many more points even than the top wide receivers because it's half-point PPR. Like last year, Todd Gurley outscored the top wide receiver by 50%. In my adjusted like how I kind of rank guys. So those top running backs are so valuable. I like getting one in the 1st. And then 3rd round this year is just loaded at running back. There's so many interesting guys in there like Kerryon Johnson, Leonard Fournette, Aaron Jones, Marlon Mack, Derrick Henry, all these guys. So almost every draft I'm grabbing one of those running backs in the 3rd round. The other spot I really like the running backs is kind of late 2nd round, Damian Williams, Todd Gurley, and some of those guys. And then a little different than David, I'm not as in on those 5th round running backs. I like waiting till kind of that 7th, 8th round area with Miles Sanders, Austin Eckler, some of those guys. And then like everyone else, I really think you need those depth running backs to fill things out late. And ideally, you're looking for a guy who doesn't need an injury to at least contribute. So somebody like Giovanni Bernard or Chase Edmonds where, they're at least getting those 5, 6, 10 touches a game. So if you need a 5 or a 6 in your lineup that week, you're fine. But then you also want, along with that little bit of floor each week, you want the guys who have a fairly clear path to being the guy if somebody goes down. So somebody like Chase Edmonds, who, I think if anything happened to David Johnson, Chase Edmonds is going to be getting 20 plus carries. So looking for those situations where you get a little bit of a floor late, but then you also have that big upside because that's the type of thing that can really swing a whole league your way is if you get one of those backup running backs like a James Conner last year where he just, he was going in the 16th, 17th round and he ends up being a top 10 player.
Yeah, that's a good point. James, what's your take on running backs?
Just to start out, you want to get a couple to start out. So usually I don't leave the third round without at least one running back. Hopefully it's the first. Hopefully I get a top 5 pick in the first. If not, I'll probably start wide receiver, and then go running back. But by round 5, I'm usually at least 2 running backs. So it's kind of – I'm just prioritizing that position. And just before I said by round 8, I like to kind of just only go running back and wide receiver, kind of have 4 and 4. So then I don't know why. So some of the – I do like – I'm looking at Baltimore and Seattle. They're just running teams. So I love Chris Carson and I love Mark Ingram and then also Latavius Murray, 7th round. So he's one of my most owned running backs. I look at him, Miles Sanders, Austin Eckler, Royce Freeman's there. And then later in the draft, Matt Breida is a nice option, like round 12, 13. And he could be a starter. You just don't know. Mike Davis is another name that we've already thrown out there. Just looking at some other ones. I was high on Carlos Hyde, but now I guess there's some conflicting news that maybe, we don't know how safe his roster spot is or things like that. So he might be kind of dialing down just a little bit. And that brings up Darwin Thompson. Is that the third string, the rookie there? Yeah. Yes. So, his name's going to start popping up now and moving up ADP. So it's all a game in training camp. You're listening to the news, you're watching the ADP, kind of seeing what situations you like best. And then usually I'm trying to get 4 running backs that are almost starters. And then the 5th and 6th, that's when I'm taking those shots on a handcuff or even a Mike Davis, who's still going to get 100 plus touches on the season. So he's still going to give you value every week. Jalen Richard was one I was on early. Last year he'd score every game. He was getting you at least 8 points. It wasn't a lot, but if you get an injured player, you're never going to get a 0. So I don't know. Yeah, those are
just to jump in on some James was saying about how, we've kind of said like ADP is fairly accurate on draft. That's generally true. I think the one time where there's some really big gaps is during this part of the year because the news moves fast where, you have these little things and, somebody goes from being more of a 14th round guy to, maybe we should be drafting this guy in the 10th round. He brought up Darwin Thompson where if he gets drafted, it's usually 17th or 18th round. If the news starts kind of trickling out like, hey, this is the real backup for Damian Williams, and maybe he belongs in the 12th or 13th round, and that ADP, there's a lag time in between, where a guy should maybe be moving up, and it takes a little while to get there. So there is kind of an edge in August if you're really paying attention and adjusting your rankings really quickly, and especially at running back, because that's the one where, like, if a guy moves up just a little bit on a depth chart or, maybe this guy's going to get 40% of the touches instead of 20, that just has such a huge impact on where you rank those guys. So running back's one of those positions where I think you want to be pretty aggressive and kind of updating as fast as you can and trying to find those little edges where maybe a guy is still kind of ranked where he was coming into August when the training camp news has maybe said he should be going a little higher.
Yeah, and I like what you guys were all said about, like, in those later running backs that you're picking, you're trying to find that guy that could suddenly pop. Like, he suddenly wins the job later in the season. That's when you're throwing darts later in the year, later in your draft, once you feel like you've got a solid stable of backs. I think that's awesome. So we're going to go into crazy, like, round-by-round detail in our third show, talking about which guys we're getting kind of in each round. But we're going to name a few more guys, sweet spots for wide receivers and tight ends, and then we'll wrap up our show. Let's see. Dan, let's go back to you and talk about wide receiver sweet spots for you. It sounds like wide receivers and running backs kind of go hand in hand a little bit here. You get wide receivers pretty early.
Yeah, I think, when I was looking through this, so one of the things I did, I went back through last year's and kind of who are the most valuable guys. And there were 15 running backs in the top 31 in terms of value on draft, what they gave you. And one of the really interesting things is 14 of those 15 guys were gone before the middle of the 4th round in ADP. So the only one of those top 15 guys that was a little lower as Robert Woods, and every single other guy was a first, second, third, or top of the fourth round guy.
You're talking about wide receivers. So at first you said running backs, and I was like confused. Okay, wide receivers.
No, just wide receivers. So yeah,
gotcha.
It's kind of like one of those things where you get what you pay for. It's really hard. You don't necessarily have a guy come out of nowhere to become a wide receiver one. We kind of know who the top guys are. The injury might have a little impact, but you're not gonna have a James Conner type situation at wide receiver, which is why, I think we're all pretty much in agreement here on kind of hitting wide receiver pretty heavy early. Because you're really unlikely to get that wide receiver one in like the 6th or 7th round. You've got to invest that first, second, third, 4th round pick on at least 1 or 2 wide receivers, just because it's hard to find a ton of upside late. You might be able to find a guy who can finish as a wide receiver too, like your Tyler Boyd type, but you're not going to get a Devontae Adams, one of those, really elite guys in the 8th round or something, where you might be able to do that at one of the other positions.
Yeah, that makes sense. David, who are sort of a guy that you're getting maybe at wide receiver sort of in the first third of the draft, maybe the second third, and then the back third, kind of to give us a roadmap for some of the sweet spots you're hitting?
Yeah, I think a key to this too is we're playing best ball. So understand that you want to be in high-powered offenses, because again, I don't have to figure out when these guys score. I just need them to score in bunches and have huge games. So guys like Tyreek Hill might go as wide receiver 4 or 5 off the board, but as a best ball receiver, he might really or should be wide receiver 1, because he's going to get it in bunches. So all of a sudden he plays a bad defense, he gets behind, he gets 2 giant scores. So I want speedsters. I want guys that are going to go deep, giant yards per carry over guys like, you see a lot of people drafting Edelman. I'm not saying that's a horrible play, but he's got to get his with a bunch of volume and a bunch of small passes. I want the guy that can catch it and go the distance. So I think when you get into, the Deshaun Jacksons of the draft, et cetera, so when you're looking over your receiver list, regardless of the list you have, look at those guys. Like, I love guys like Tyler Lockett. I love guys like Kenny Golladay. Those are guys that could just bust for giant games. And those are the guys I'm generally targeting at receiver. So yeah, I even think a guy like, not super speedster, but even a guy like Mohamed Sanu, where you've got an offense where, Atlanta doesn't get sacked much. Matt Ryan doesn't get sacked. He's super accurate. What if one of those top 2 guys gets hurt? They're already running a ton of 3 wide receiver sets, so Sanu could just have massive volume. So I'm generally looking to secure my wide receivers in really high prolific offenses. I'll take shots on New Orleans offense, Green Bay's offense, etc.
Yeah, high variance players are not your enemy in a best ball format.
No.
James, what do you think about wide receiver?
I think there's I think that's you want to go heavy early, and I think there's lots of value throughout the draft in wide receiver. Some of my favorites, like Allen Robinson. He's one of my favorites. He's going like 6th round every time. He's like the number 1 in Chicago. Chicago's supposed to be on increase this year in offense. I just like that value. The other guys like Alshon Jeffrey, I like his values. Like I just think those 2 are devalued compared to just kind of their seasons last year. And last year they kind of were injured to start the year, so they kind of were tainted a little bit, maybe their ADP, and I think it's carrying over to this year. So I kind of like both of them, and I think they're both on good offenses, got young quarterbacks. And then in the later rounds, I'm looking. You can like Corey Davis. I like taking a shot on him, but usually I'm getting him, and he's my 4th or 5th wide receiver. So it's not a huge risk. Like, oh, Corey Davis, he hasn't shown anything in 2 years, and he plays in the Titans offense. So, there's definitely some question marks there, but also if you're getting him and your 4th wide receiver, and the upside's there, he could have this breakout year. And I'm trying to find guys like that where I can get ahead of the curve on them and catch that breakout. And it's great value. Some of the late guys too, like John Brown in Buffalo, he's where I have him now, 13th round is ADP, and if he's the starter there, you're getting him as your wide receiver 6, and he flex spot or wide receiver 3 on your team, score probably 5 or 6 times throughout the year, and that's a 13th round pick. So I'm just kind of, and like David said, you're looking for good offenses. That's what you want. You want to look for those passing offenses, and not even later in the draft, you can find them as well.
Yeah, even teams' second and third receivers on a really high-powered offense can sometimes have a handful of really big games that can help you out.
For sure.
Now, it seems like quarterback and tight end sort of lend themselves a little bit better to the conversation about finding like a sweet spot, like a key round you're looking for. David, I'll go back to you. Let's talk about tight ends. Is there I think you said you basically try to ignore tight ends in the first 8 rounds. When did they come into play for you?
Yeah, I in the perfect draft, I will have Austin Hooper in the 9th and Kyle Rudolph in the 11th every single draft.
Yeah.
And you get that a lot of times. So I have those guys rostered a tremendous amount. The Kyle Rudolph one is just amazing to me in that he went late early in these drafts because he was holding out. There was some talk he has re-signed his contract. He's on that team. He is their starting tight end. I don't get it why he's going in 11th. And I think, again, that Atlanta offense is going to be high-powered. Austin Hooper's become a bigger and bigger and bigger role, probably going to be a big red zone look for them. Again, 9th and 11th rounds, I look to go there. When I miss on those guys, I'm almost looking at the final rounds of the draft as everybody else has already used up all their spots. And I know no one's even competing. So guys that probably should go in the 13th or 14th, a lot of times will go in the 16th, 17th, and 18th.
Yeah. So if your top guys sort of slip past you, you're finding a backup plan it works at tight end. James, what's your tight end strategy? I think you kind of said the same thing. It kind of ignored tight end the first 8 rounds.
Oh yeah, it's kind of funny he mentioned those 2 names. Austin Hooper's my number 1 owned, and then Kyle Rudolph's number 3. Dallas Goedert's number 2 there. I just like his touchdown upside. He's perfect to pair with. If you get one of the top 10 tight ends, he's perfect pair. And if he has a upside game and get you a touchdown or 2, it's gonna help your roster. I actually like David Njoku out of Cleveland. I just think like he gets so much bad rep. Like everyone's just been talking him down, and he was like round 6, kind of in that tier with Hindrey and Howard and Ingram there for a while. He was, but now he's dropped like 3-4 rounds, and I'm getting him in the 9th round. And I just think get a piece of Cleveland's offense. It's worth the risk to me. And because then you just get to pair him with a Hooper or somebody, and I'm done at tight end.
There you go. Dan, what's your tight end approach?
I think I'm a little different from these guys. I'm willing to look at. I really like that tier in the 5th, 6th, 7th round because I think Hunter Henry's pretty interesting. Just a young guy. Seemed like he was ready to break out last year, and then he got injured, and now he's healthy. And there's some good reports in camp. He's a guy who, if he falls towards that 5-6 turn, especially in the 6th round, I like him, and OJ Howard in that same range. And then Vance McDonald is pretty interesting in the next round just because there's just so many open targets in Pittsburgh. And then I'm kind of skipping those middle rounds a little bit now that Mark Andrews has moved up. And I think there's a ton of value in the 12th, 13th round. One of the guys I'm focused in on is Jordan Reed, just because he's the perfect best ball guy. You don't really have to rely on him to be there every week. But, if he's there and he's finally healthy, it seems like he produces whenever he's on the field. So he's good. And then in the late rounds, there are some really interesting higher upside guys, maybe than other years where like Darren Waller, you can get in the 16th, 17th round. And I think he's essentially just going to be the wide receiver 3 in Oakland, but you get to play him as a tight end. So if I take a third tight end, there's some really nice options late, even Tyler Eifert, some of those guys. So I'm kind of spread out a little bit. I'm mostly passing on like Ertz and Kittle just because I think the running backs in that range have so much more upside. But aside from that, those other top tight ends like OJ Howard, Henry, Ebron, Vance McDonald, I like getting one of those guys as my tight end 1 and give myself a little bit more upside at the position.
Nice. Well, guys, we got 2 more episodes that we're going to do for people listening. This is a good sort of introduction and a broad picture of kind of each position and what we think of it. For those of you listening, visit footballguys.com for our latest best ball articles and our latest subscription deals. And a big thank you to David Dodds and Dan Hindrey and James Brimacombe for sharing their best ball knowledge. on this episode. Be sure to check out episode 2 in this Best Ball trilogy, where we'll be talking about the $3.5 million draft championship, as well as their mini and mega tournaments. If you want to skip to that show now, click on the video that's on David's face. And if you want to watch video number 3, that's going to be our round by round identifying our favorite picks. You want to skip to that video? Click on the video on James' face. And if you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, click on the Black Eyed Joe that just popped up on Dan's face. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Austin Lee saying thanks for watching and thanks for being a football guy.